Okay, this last page, you have a composition of functions. You might want to pause and try this on your own. Right? This just means h of f of x. That means you're going to take the function f of x and input that function in for your x here. So that's what I did. I put 1/4 x minus pi into my x. So it's 2 times 1/4 x minus pi over 2. I simplified it. When you simplify it, you should have gotten this trig function, sine 1/2 of x minus 5 pi plus 1. So what's the period? You should have gotten a period of 4 pi, and you should have gotten an amplitude of 1. Okay, even and odd identities. We talked about it graphically. If it's odd, it's symmetric with respect to the origin, so it has rotational symmetry. If you put in the opposite of x, you get the opposite of y. Again, that should make sense, right? If the sine curve is odd, when we put in the opposite of x, so this right here is pi over 2, 1. So when we put in the opposite of x, which is negative pi over 2, we get the opposite of y, which is negative 1. So that's why the sine curve is odd. The cosine curve is even. It's symmetric with respect to the y-axis. So if you fold your paper over the y-axis, you get the same y value. So when you put in the opposite of x, so here's my cosine curve, right? Here, if I put in, this is pi, negative 1. When I put in the opposite of x, I get the same value. When I put in the opposite of negative pi, I still get the same y value. So when you put in the opposite of x, you get the same as your original y value. That's even function. For this last one, this is a review of last year. Right, what do? We would reverse this to put the negative x first, factor out a negative 1, we get x minus 1/2, x minus pi over 2. So this orange graph that I made was just ignoring this negative sign right here. So that would be my orange graph. But then that negative sign makes us reflect over the y-axis. So if I reflect these points over the y-axis, then I have my blue graph, which now represents f of x equals cosine of pi over 2 minus x. So is your blue graph even, odd, or neither? Well, looking at this, we could turn our paper 180 degrees. Oops, so therefore it is odd because it has rotational symmetry. Now, what does this blue graph look like? So f of x equals cosine of pi over 2 minus x. How else could we name this blue graph right here? Well, hopefully you see that it's just the sine curve, except it's a negative because it's going down the opposite direction. So cosine of pi over 2 minus x is the same as negative sine of x. And sine of x is what? Oops, sorry. Sine of x is what kind of curve? Well, it's an odd function. Sorry, what kind of function? It's an odd function. So when you put in the opposite of x, you would get the opposite y. So it's an odd function, so therefore this was an odd function as we said. Here is a little summary of even and odd functions here for you at the end. Have a look. Sine functions are odd, cosine functions are even. Tangent is odd because when you take odd and divide it by even, sine over cosine, we're doing division. Odd produces a negative y value, or the opposite y value. Even produces the original y value. So opposite and the original changes into a negative, which is the opposite, so it's an odd function. Reciprocal functions are the same as the original. All right, that's it. If you have questions, make sure you come see one of the pre-calc teachers. Bye.